Yo, what up, Street Dogs? There, Kim, or at the thought. I wanted to share with you some thoughts on black and white photography, how you could also master monochrome. So the first question we got to think about is, why monochrome? And this is a question that's very interesting to me because, I kind of like this quote. I don't know if it's Heraclitus or one of the pre-Socratics or kind of a Zen Buddhist Taoist notion is where you begin is where you shall end up. And starting off photography, digital photography, I shot with a Canon SD 600. I still remember. I think it's like a 1 megapixel digital point and shoot. And from the get-go, color digital photography was kind of aesthetically ugly to me, and black and white was my initial joy and beauty because it just aesthetically looked nicer. And also black and white was able to help simplify the scene. So with black and white monochrome, I was able to better see compositions, shapes, textures, and so forth, and it just felt more aesthetically beautiful or artistic. And even nowadays, I like to shoot both monochrome and color, but I think what it is the periods where I get bored of monochrome, shooting color is useful because shooting color re-invokes my interest and passion for monochrome, and I find it to be even more beautiful. And I think for me, so at the end of the day in photography, 90% of my passion is probably monochrome, 10% is in color, and certainly is different for everybody. But my biggest thought about monochrome is the reason why monochrome is more artistic is that it disdains reality. It doesn't look like reality. And I think this is an important concept because too often we try to think about capturing photos which are like photorealistic, but now if we think of us photographers as more artists, visual artists, then perhaps the better goal is to make photos that look as unreal to reality as possible. And so there are certain concepts and principles which are useful to making more powerful monochrome images. So one of them is figure to ground. Figure is your subject, ground is your background, and in other ways, contrast. And so one way to achieve better figure to ground in your photos is using a flash. So this is a photo I shot in downtown LA in 2011, and sometimes people don't like to have their faces photographed, but I said, oh, I love your fingernails. Can I photograph your fingernails instead? Shot this with a Leica M9, used the Leica, I think, SF20 flash or whatever, and I just focused on her hands. So one of the main reasons why figure to ground is important is that if there's not clear separation between the subject matter and the background, visually it's kind of a little bit difficult to see what's going on. So different ways you could test whether your figure to ground is good. So in Photoshop there's something called Gaussian blur, and if you apply the Gaussian blur filter, you could kind of get better sense of the shapes and the outline of the image. And so you can see we have a nice relatively clean background, black background, and then you have the white grays of the hands which kind of pop out. Another pro tip to better see the figure to ground in your photos is by inverting it. So here we've inverted the image, and now there's a clean white background and just the black figures. So you can see it kind of looks like a Rorschach ink blot test, and there's still enough separation between the hands and the background. So visually, even if you take a step back or you kind of squint your eyes, you could still see kind of what's going on. And to even further accentuate this, increasing the curves on the image, now you could really kind of get a sense of visually what's kind of going on. And so I think the name of the game is trying to achieve some sort of separation between the subject matter and the background. So here it is outlined in red, and that's kind of essentially the visual gist of the image. And you can see here outlined in blue, this is the negative space in between the hands. So one of the primary mistakes we often do in photography and black and white photography is when the subject matter is overlapped or I think maybe they call it occluded in computer vision, our brain is not able to visually separate the two. So having some sort of separation between the elements is very effective. So you can see I've kind of darkened the hands here to get a better sense of the separation. So like for example, you're photographing people or hands, just have things separated a little bit. And a lot of this comes from this notion of gestalt theory, is that, you know, in between you could kind of see things which are there. So in figure A, you know, you could either see three Pac-Man or you could see the triangle which exists in between. And the funny thing is, the human mind is quite incredible, because if you look at figure A, there is actually technically no triangle in the center. It's our minds which fill in the blanks. It's like a visual autocomplete. Same thing in figure B. A lot of us see continuity in this line, but in fact, it's actually two more like apostrophe figures. If you look at figure C, it kind of looks like the Super Mario, one of those 3D spike balls, but actually, in fact, there is no spherical 3D ball. Our brain comes up with this, and in D, you might see like a Loch Ness monster and stuff like that. And so, essentially, I think the reason why black and white is so interesting is that because it hides certain information, it gives us, the viewer, the photographer, or the participant, to fill in the blanks with our own imagination. So anything that could provide more imagination, the better. So also something that's interesting for me in photography in black and white is composition. And I tend to think that composition works better in black and white because it allows us to distill the image to focus on the composition. Now, I love color photography, and certainly you could do this with color photography, but black and white just kind of simplifies it, makes it easier. So this is one photo that I shot of Cindy, and you know, this notion of the golden section is called the golden triangle, the golden rectangle, the golden mean, stuff like that. Essentially, the general gist is, in nature, there tends to be certain growth patterns and proportions, which there's creates something called fractals, which is like this law of self-similarity. And a simple way to just kind of diagram this is just draw a diagonal from one corner to the other, roughly a perpendicular 45-degree angle, and your eyes tend to just kind of, you know, end up here. And if you think about like the Fibonacci spiral, our eyes kind of go to that spot. So once again, you could take the Fibonacci spiral and kind of overlay it over your images to get a better sense of how the compositions work. And if you look at the different color blocks I've created, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, it kind of goes through the spiral, and eventually your eyes end up around here. Another quick way you could see this in Lightroom, is you open up the picture in Lightroom, classic, and you press D, develop. You press the little crop button, hotkey is R, and you could press the hotkey O to change the overlays. So here you could see the golden triangle grid pattern over the images. And the hotkey, one of the tips is when you press, you could just, you know, go through it. If you press Shift and O at the same time, it will actually change the orientation of your grid. So you could kind of play around with that in Lightroom. So what makes a great monochrome photo or image? And I think there's obviously a quadrillion different things, but if I could distill it most simply, I think it comes down to emotion, you know, the visual impact, how you feel about the photo is, now we talk a lot about like emotional IQ or whatnot, but typically we humans tend to remember emotions more than, you know, kind of empirical fact-based things. So anything that you could do to maximize the emotion in a photo, the better. And so this is like one photo that I shot in Cuba, and it's kind of, to me, a personal photo. It's like a father and his child, and it kind of reminds me of the Pieta, but the fact that the dad's face is obscured in black is quite effective, and the fact that you can see this daughter, to me, it feels very intimate and very personal, and that's the emotion I get from the photo. It makes it an effective one for me. And the second part of what makes a a great black and white image is aesthetics. So aesthetics comes from Greek, aesthetikos, I think, and it generally means perception. How do we perceive an image from the geometry, shapes, lines, forms, etc.? And there's lots of different principles when it comes to composition, but even like this picture, it was in Tokyo. I had a clear umbrella shot with the Ricoh GR2 P mode with a flash through the clear umbrella, and as a result, it brought out all these nice little white dots, which are just the rain splatter on the umbrella. And it's kind of nice because it adds a nice little repetition to the photo, and it's just like a nice aesthetic which actually enhances the mood of this photo, which is like a little bit like dark and gloomy, but I think it actually makes it a little bit more beautiful. There's also this notion that goes back to like Leonardo da Vinci Renaissance times. It's an Italian word, catescudo, which essentially means in English clear plus obscure. Chiaro in English, American English, it just means clear. Oscuro means obscure. So what that means is in your photographs, to make a more visually powerful, impactful image, you need some of it which is clear and some of it which is obscure. So in this photograph, the clear part, the chiaro part, is the man's face, and the oscuro part is the black background. A photo I shot recently of Cindy, the light source is behind her, and what is obscured is her eyes and half her nose and half her lips. But that's what's also clear is part of her nose, her lips, and the hand gesture. So I think that more visually impactful monochrome images tend to be the images where it doesn't tell the full story. So by obscuring parts of your frame and also bringing others to light, once again, it allows the viewer to use their imagination to fill in the details, and therefore become more engaged. It becomes like a visual puzzle. Like, they're trying to figure out what's going on. And so try not to, the practical thing you could do is like shoot -1 or -2 exposure compensation if you want to darken the darks, or +1, +2 exposure compensation plus if you want to brighten up the image to also make things a little bit more obscure. And one tip I have, something you could do is you could invert your photos. So here, by inverting the photo, you can see there's actually still no detail in the shadows. And I've been playing around a lot with my images in Procreate on the iPad. This is the halftone filter, so it could help you better distill the composition of the image. Another different type of the halftone filter. So you can still kind of get a general gist of the hand gesture, the face, the nose, the head. Kind of like Picasso, Cubism vibes. This is actually a sketch Cindy did of herself in Procreate, which I think is quite beautiful. Something I did in Procreate was I just drew the gist of the image. So this is the photo. I'm like, I imported the photo into Procreate. I'm like, if I could just do a bunch of squiggles in calligraphy, how would it feel? And so for me, this is like the visual distillation of how it feels. Like this is her head, and that's the gesture and the motion of the hand. This is also me just using Procreate to create an abstract image of just how it feels. So this is kind of like her head, her hand, and this is the dynamism of the image. And so in creating more impactful images, simple things you could do is obscure the face. This is a photo I shot in Tokyo, part of my Dark Skies Over Tokyo series. I intentionally actually burned in his face in Photoshop, and by obscuring his face, he could become anybody, which is more interesting visually. The fun thing, I was curious, I'm like, is there still details in this image? So I busted out the curves function, and actually, in fact, the face does exist, which is always quite fun, right? Inverted. Another technique is creating silhouettes. So the nice thing with silhouettes is you could see the outline of someone's face and stuff like that, and it obscures the subject, but also what's clear is the backgrounds. And a pro tip when you're photographing silhouettes of people's faces, make sure there's just enough white space around the head to kind of make sure the nose or another element of the face isn't cut out. Another thing you could do with black and white, and I think the reason why black and white is so interesting is that black and white in itself is surreal. We don't see the world in black and white, we see it in color, and therefore the more you can enhance the sense of surrealism, the better. So, for example, this photograph in Cuba, Cindy, you can see her eyes are cut out, which makes it more mysterious. But then you see an eye here, so you could even fill in the blanks and think that, oh, her eyes here could actually belong here. So it's like kind of face shifting. Alex Webb does this a lot in his photos, which makes for fun surrealism. So the practical takeaway is, if you're photographing your subjects, cut off their eyes or half their face and try to add another face somewhere else. Looks like a headless horseman. And I think the reason why this is also quite surreal, I shot this in Sapa in Vietnam. He has the butcher knife. It looked like he could have chopped off his own head, and I kind of like the sleeving line here. I wish there was a little more white separation here, but c'est la vie. Another photograph of kind of one of the oxen or bulls or water buffalo coming at me. I just got in front, shot negative exposure compensation. It was quite misty, and I kind of like this kid in the background. And then the sense of surrealism is that, oh, this might look like some sort of devil ox or something kind of coming at me. Another thing I've been experimenting with is low versus high dynamic range in photography. So I think there is still so much unpaved ground in black and white photography, even though it's been around forever. Typically, the main innovations is just obviously black and white photography, and then high contrast, grainy, gritty black and white photography. But I don't really see as many people doing like HDR, high dynamic range of black and white photography, where you're kind of bringing out more details between the darker parts and the lighter parts of the frame. And so that's something I've been experimenting with, where on my Ricoh GR3, I'll shoot in the JPEG HDR function, and then I'll import it into my computer, and then I'll later convert it to black and white in Lightroom or even the default Apple Photos app, adding the Noir filter and so forth. And it's kind of nice because typically the reason I don't like HDR photography by default's color is that it almost looks a little bit too hyper reality, where aesthetically there's just too much detail, looks ugly to me. So black and white kind of softens it out. So for example, this is a photo we shot at the beach, and it's like 32 degrees, it's like frozen. Initially shot at high contrast black and white, and there just wasn't enough detail, which didn't make it as interesting. So I ended up shooting HDR, went home, converted to black and white, and while it still tends to be a little bit more too much detail for me, I still kind of do like the fact that I can see the details in the sand, details in the water and the sky. So I think moving forward, I'll try to tone this down a little bit. If you convert it, if you invert it, you get better see the details as well. And a fun thing I've been doing in Procreate, adding gradient maps. So you could even take your images and make into more other forms of interesting visual arts. And even if you add a Gaussian blurred, you could still see Cindy's still the darkest figure here. You got the black fence. You got the kind of the white of the skies. You have the grays here. So even in terms of the color tones or the black and white tones, it's quite balanced. Another technique you could do, and this is pretty popular among street photographers, is crushing the blacks. And the basic notion is in Photoshop or in Lightroom or Apple Photos, there's a black slider, is that if you drag it to one extreme, it totally obscures what's in the darker regions of the photos. And I kind of like it too, because once again, it adds more strong visual impact. This is shot with a flash, and so increasing contrast is a kind of a aesthetically cool one. This is shot at the Hoan Kiem Lake in Hanoi, and this is actually interesting. I shot this on the Ricoh GR2 program mode during the day with a flash, and the flash was able to just kind of lighten up these flowers. So also like the silhouette of the man, see his eyelashes and a little bit of the separation here. Shot of a woman's hands in Paris. Shot this on the Ricoh GR2 with a flash, program mode, macro mode. And actually the original image, there's like a little bit of her bag or sweater here or something. And then in Lightroom, I used the exposure adjustment brush and I just burned it out. And so, I mean, it's funny because a lot of people, oh, but that's cheating. I'm like, yeah, but like my friend Soren says, if you could use it back in the film darkroom, the digital Lightroom, it's probably fine too. But the more and more I'm thinking about photography, I mean, there's no such thing as a sacred photograph. We should just be making photos which bring us visual joy and delight. So essentially there are no rules. Another photograph of a woman in Vietnam, 92 years old. And I just love photographing hands and textures. I think often someone's hands could actually tell a better story than their own face. Another pro tip, following the eyes, what that means is when you look at a photograph, your eyes will track the eyes of the subject in the image. So in this picture, I asked Cindy to look up, and you can see her eyes are looking upwards. And therefore, as a viewer, your eyes will also follow. And this is something called the arabesque, Arabesque, which essentially is just like a squiggly line. A lot of Middle Eastern Arabic artists realize that squiggly lines are much more dynamic than just straight lines. And what I love about the image is that it kind of gives you a sense of like your eyes are going beyond the frame. And so to realize that philosophically, photos aren't self-contained, it better highlights the beautiful reality of life, the real life, the embodied reality that exists beyond the frame. And the last concept I wanted to share is this notion of the will to simplicity. And a nice Steve Jobs quote, "Simple can be harder than complex. You have to work hard to get your thinking clean to make it simple, but it's worth it in the end because once you get there, you can move mountains." From his biography by Walter Isaacson. Huge Steve Jobs fanboy. And I think the ultimate name of the game in photography is you're trying to create the optimally most emotionally impactful and also visually impactful photo from aesthetics, but also still trying to balance that delicate line between too complicated, but you want to kind of keep it simple. So I generally think there's a difference between complicated and complex. Complicated is bad. Complex could be good. So to make something simple, you could have lots of different complex things in a frame. So for example, there's this hexagonal shape. I'm shooting over her shoulder, so there's layers here, hand gestures here. But it's simple enough because it's a relatively white background and there's no other distracting elements. So as a black and white photographer and visual artist, try to think about this notion of simplicity to the utmost, where you're trying to take the insane, complicated, complex nature of reality to simplify it, to best highlight the signal of beauty in life, of your loved ones, and of reality in existence.